Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy, also known as Byron of Sidious. This is American Minotaur, written by yours truly, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy. Chapter 13. O'Connell looked Janga up and down, brow furrowed. "You must have mostly dealt with my brother Patrick back home then," he remarked. "Him and I were often mistaken for one another, though, leastwise until he lost his ear." "Well, what should I call you then?" the hobgoblin asked. Ashkar, seated at the bar with a bourbon in hand, felt the grin slither across his face before Henry O'Connell could even answer. "You'll call me O'Connell or boss, so far as I'm concerned. Anyhow, Ash has a few names jotted down on folks who haven't ponied up from last week's lost bets on the college games. You can help go and collect today and tomorrow. As for Saturday, you can come in here and serve while Ash and I take some much-needed time off." "Sounds good, boss," the hobgoblin said. Ashkar downed his drink and hopped down off of his stool, sauntering over toward Janga. "Hey, thanks for the lookout, brother," Janga said quietly. "Yeah, not a problem, Jan, my man." "Here," he said, pulling a notepad out of his back pants pocket and tearing out one of the sheets near the back. "You take these 3. Be careful with the last guy here. He's a bit of a gun nut. I'd swing by that address around 8 tomorrow morning if you want your best shot of not coming under the crosshairs." "Why's that?" "That's about the time he puts his kids in the car to take them to school," Ashkar remarked. "Ah, got it. He don't want to risk his kids seeing him get into a scrape of any kind or be in any sort of crossfire," the hobgoblin said with a nod. "Just so. He won't even risk carrying with his kids with him, from what I've seen. Besides, I don't think he's dodging us to begin with. I think he just hasn't had a chance to swing by." Janga nodded, and Ashkar looked over his own remaining names. He had been to each of their homes, so he didn't need to go through the challenge of tracking down their addresses, or where they worked, since he'd also followed them each to those places as well. He wondered if Titus had picked up on that bit of instinctive wisdom yet. A well-traveled Minotaur is a dangerous one. He'd have to ask the boy about that the next time they had a sit-down. O'Connell slapped the bar counter and growled at his employees wordlessly, pointing at the last 2 patrons over at their usual table in the corner. "Right. Go on and tell them to piss off, Ash. I want to close up early tonight," the boss man said. "Pats are playing the Jets tonight, and kickoff's in 20. I'll miss as little of it as possible." Ashkar made his way over to their regulars and convinced them to top themselves off and make a quick escape from the pub for the evening. When he turned back toward the bar, Janga was already gone, following closely behind the Humes, who had just vacated. "You're sure he can be trusted, then?" "Not in the slightest," Ashkar confessed as he started pushing in chairs around the main room. "Not unless we can get him to make a promise, an oath. That's how his people work, remember?" Right, that," O'Connell said, closing up the till after putting the day's earnings in an envelope and dropping it down into the safe under the floorboards on his side of the bar. "I always found that a bit strange. Useful, though. I'll have to pull an oath out of him as soon as I can." O'Connell gave Ashkar a curious look. "Does he have one to you, too, then? From the old country?" "No. I released him from the one that he had not long after we got dropped into this world. I figured we all had enough baggage to haul around, being in a foreign land outside of our willing it, so why pile on the guy, right?" Ashkar went about his task, promising to lock up after he was finished, and O'Connell headed for his own humble apartment to watch his precious New England Patriots on Thursday Night Football. "This isn't right," Titus thought, as he looked downfield at the scoreboard a couple of days later, watching the clock as it marched its inexorable way toward the game's end. This has got to be a joke, right? But he knew it wasn't a joke, not in the slightest. Every year, Buff State had one marquee game against a team that everyone agreed they couldn't hope to compete with. A lopsided matchup that most of the players and coaching staff just chalked up as an assumed loss for their record. Most years, they managed to avoid a complete shutout, and that would be true this year as well. Still, to be down 35-6 with only 8 minutes left in the game left Titus feeling like he had missed some cosmic joke that the universe would never quite explain the punchline to. To begin with, Ridgeworth College's quarterback, a lithe villain named Darrens, never held on to the football for more than a 3-step drop, rifling the ball out to his tight end or running backs on screens with the pinpoint accuracy of a machine, eating up yards after the catch that kept giving them first downs every play or two. Secondly, each time Titus thought he had a jump on his blockers, the ball would already have been shoveled off to Ridgeworth's halfback, a lightning bolt of a Hume named Rogers, who gashed the opposite end of the line from Titus every time he got his hands on the ball, and who just outran almost every other defender the Bengals had on the team. Only by shutting down his angles did they manage to force him out of bounds on each of his rush attempts, and by the time they did, he'd snatched between 8 and 15 yards away from them. It was, in a word, a drubbing. In their final away game of the season, the boys of Buff State were going to get the short end of the stick. Trying to handle the responsibilities of putting together a game plan for both sides of the ball, even Coach Reynolds' skill as a coach had been pushed beyond his abilities, and Titus felt the sting of guilt that he just couldn't figure out the audible being called out every couple of downs when Ridgeworth's offense was on the field. Now, watching as yet another punt sailed away to Ridgeworth on 4th down, he found himself silently praying for just one more chance to get his hands on Darrens. He'd managed to barely bring the Catman down twice, once barely grabbing a foot as the agile QB tried to hurdle up over his broadside lunge. The other had come on a rare broken play, wherein a designed reverse got pitched back to Darrens like a flea flicker, and Titus had landed on him like a freight train. But the guy was tough, popping up off the turf like nothing had happened. Shaking his head, Titus watched as the ball came tumbling down toward Ridgeworth's return man, and as he snatched the ball out of the air, Titus thought he saw something unusual. A kind of shimmer or shine on the guy's hands. "Wait a minute," he rumbled, stalking up the sideline toward where Coach Reynolds stood with the other staff, watching as the returner carved up the field, dodging and darting around Buff State's punt team. He was finally dragged down around Ridgeworth's own 40-yard line, and as the refs blew the play dead, Titus's suspicion grew stronger, spotting the way the returner tapped the back of his own glove pointedly before dropping the ball. He quickly leaned down to rasp in Coach Reynolds' ear. "Coach, get the refs. We're being scammed here." Reynolds took a step away from Titus and scowled up at him. "What the hell are you talking about, son? That's a pretty serious accusation, and it's looking like sour grapes given the score they've run up on us today." Titus's mind's eye turned to the box that Ashkar had given him for safekeeping and not yet asked for back, sitting tucked under his bed at home, and the faint shimmer that surrounded it whenever Titus took a peek under there at it. "I know enchantments when I see them, Coach. You gotta trust me on this," Titus said, his own heartbeat climbing. If he was wrong about this, he would never hear the end of it, he knew. He would be dubbed a sore loser, and his reputation with Coach Reynolds might never recover. Reynolds stepped away from Titus toward the officials and called for a timeout, then stalked over to the other coaches and staff to confer. Titus wasn't close enough to hear what was being said, though he couldn't mistake it when Reynolds pointed toward him, then out at the opposing sideline. When Coach Tennant, the Lizard Man offensive coach and only magic user on staff, stepped past Reynolds to actually set foot on the field, his reaction was immediate and audible to Titus. "I am so fucking blind," Tennant half shouted. He darted back over to Reynolds, And seconds later, the entire coaching staff for Buff State started moving in a flock toward the game officials, who looked to Titus like they wanted to instinctively flee. After a good minute of gesticulating and words being exchanged in half-shouts, one of the officials blew his whistle loudly, and the entire group of zebras, Tenet trailing right behind them, started over toward the Ridgeworth sideline. Gentlemen, I know it isn't ideal, but a tie is not the worst thing that could have come out of this situation today, Coach Reynolds said, as the last of his players took his seat on the bus for the ride back to the Buffalo State campus. Reynolds himself stood at the front between the two foremost benches, looking back over the team. And let's not forget that even if their receivers hadn't been wearing spelled-up gloves, we still weren't getting very good coverage on any of those screenplays, boys. For all we know, they still would have carved us up out there today. Frankly, I owe all of you an apology, Coach Tenet chimed in, standing up from his seat to Reynolds' right, turning to face the team. I've gotten much too comfortable being around everyday Monday things, not seeing much magic in this world. Moreover, the timing on this couldn't be worse. A lot of folks were only just starting to forget a little bit about the Hawthorne stiff arm. I imagine that doesn't include you guys. The folks involved in the field where a scandal takes place usually have a pretty solid grasp on its recent history, after all. Titus thought back on the Hawthorne controversy, an incident that had happened when he was barely 9 years old and only really paying attention to NFL games the Bills featured in. In 2009, the Pittsburgh Steelers had a running back by the name of Reginald Hawthorne, a talented Gotrin player who had been undrafted in 2007 when he declared himself for it, but who got picked up just after the draft was over when Pittsburgh's front office determined that a couple of their veteran backs wouldn't be returning for the next season. Hawthorne had proven himself exceedingly competent in the 2008 preseason, and after their first-string halfback got hurt halfway through the season, the Ratman running back stepped into the gap and dominated the run game for the Steelers. They wouldn't get past the divisional round in the playoffs that season, but everybody agreed when they were eliminated that Hawthorne was the future in Pittsburgh. Then, in 2009, during the Week 3 game against the Miami Dolphins, Hawthorne took a jet sweep to the left sideline, and just before he was about to be shoved out of bounds, he stiff-armed a defender, which sent the other player flying through the air to land in the stands among the crowd. It had been so unreal that the refs had immediately called the game to a standstill, and they inspected Hawthorne's equipment. They discovered that Hawthorne was himself a magic user, and that he had been using spell work and temporary enchantments to boost his own performance since his college football days. He was immediately banned from the remainder of the game, fined and suspended by the league for 4 more weeks, and after his suspension was over, the Steelers' ownership bit the bullet and terminated his contract. Commentators almost universally expected the league to penalize the Pittsburgh ownership, but in light of what had happened, they defended the Steelers organization's decision. Hawthorne didn't put up any kind of legal fight, accepting the breakage of his contract and leaving the sport altogether. My point is, gentlemen, we here all love this game best when it's played clean, Tenet said. And if any of you ever asks me to give you an edge on game day with a spell, I'll turn your feet into blocks of wood. Tenet turned and sat back down, and someone tapped on Titus's shoulder. The Minotaur turned his head, looking Richards in his terrified face. Can he do that, T? Like, cast a spell and turn us into bugs or something weird like that? Titus held back a laugh and shrugged his shoulders as if he didn't know, then turned back to facing forward, smiling impishly. Jenga stuck the earbud into his left ear, lit a cigarette, and dialed from his contacts list. When it started to ring, he got the car running and eased his way out into the street, heading back for his place. After 5 rings, the other end clicked on. "Report," said the gravelly voice of his contact. "It's not at his bar," the hobgoblin said, slowing down at a red light to an appropriate halt. "I just got finished scouring that place from top to bottom, and there's nothing out of sorts, other than he's got a couple of guns tucked behind a false wall panel in his back storeroom, along with some ammunition and a couple of grenades. That, and he's got a picture of himself with his brother in the safe behind the bar. Must have been when they were younger." "Understood. Has he taken you on as an employee?" "A gopher for now, yeah. He had me run the joint today, though, so him and Sutek could take some time away. I'll try to swing by his apartment tomorrow while he's at the bar. I jotted down the address off an old electric bill he had sitting in his little office behind the bar." "Why not just take the bill?" "Because he might notice it missing. I've done this sort of thing before, sir." "Do you think it's likely to be at his personal residence, then?" "It's possible," Jenga said, making his turn and heading toward Buffalo's East End, where he had his own residence. "To be honest, though, I think that's highly unlikely. I'm hoping there'll be some kind of a clue at his place as to where he might have it stashed. A key for a safe deposit box or something. Maybe a storage locker notice. Something like that. I got lucky with the electric bill. Not a lot of folks who take their personal mail into their workplace." "Check in again if you find it, or if you figure out a next step," his contact said, cutting the call off afterward. Jenga made his way to his little apartment building, parked in his assigned spot in the underground parking lot, and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. When he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the hobgoblin made his way back to the lone bedroom, tucking his small automatic pistol in his fire safe before heading to the living room to watch some mindless television. He'd get the job done, come hell or high water. There was just too much money on the line not to. When John Jacobson came into the kitchen on Sunday morning, Titus flinched at the sight of him. His left hand was almost entirely covered in bandaging, with a full splint on the last 2 digits, which he raised in a smart-ass wave to his son. "Dad, what the hell happened?" "It was about an hour after you left to catch the bus to your game," John replied, giving Linda a peck on the cheek as he passed by her to the coffee pot. He tried to pour it himself until his wife tutted him and gently nudged him aside, making it just how he liked and taking it to the table for him. John sat down and hitched a sigh. "I was down in the basement, taking the old weeder apart finally. I'm getting older now, and I've got reliable guys doing most of the jobs we get hired for. Plumbers of any kind of quality are hard to come by, so I'm lucky I've got them working for me. Anyway, when I was pulling one of the plate pulleys off of its spindle, the top base plate slipped off its peg and came right down on my pinky and ring fingers." Titus winced. "Yeah, I had a slightly more violent reaction than that." "I can imagine. I guess that means I'm finally carving the turkey this year, eh?" Titus snickered, and his mom and dad exchanged one of those knowing looks, the kind that told him that they had something important to tell or ask him. "Oh, no. What is it, guys?" "We think you should invite Ashkar to Thanksgiving with us," Mom said, returning her full attention to the pan in which she was making the eggs. Sorry, one moment. Then flipping the sausage patties in their pan. "You're the only real family he has here," John added by way of explanation. Titus knew the tone of his voice and the look in his dad's eyes. This had not been his idea, but he was going along with it out of respect and love of his wife. "If it helps any, we asked the Turkins to come this year, too. Well, after we got back from the hospital, anyway. Tarion was more than happy for the invite." "Yeah, well, no offense to Misha's mother, but She's not a great cook, Titus remarked. She's an excellent baker, though, which I will never understand. Baking is very exact, very measured, Mom said over by the stove. Cooking a meal is much more flexible, more room for improvisation. Remember those biscuits I made the other Sunday? Improv. You can't really do that with baking, not unless you're extremely talented or experienced. She brought a couple of trivets over to the table and set the pans on them, while Titus fetched plates and forks. The Jacobsons then settled in for their Sunday routine. When Titus was finished scrubbing off his plate and setting it in the dish rack, he told his parents he was going to go ahead and make the invitation call up in his room. "I'll set up for our matinee," Dad said, ambling toward the living room. Titus hoofed it upstairs, hesitating on his desk chair with his phone in hand. He had felt enthusiastic about the afternoon he'd spent with his birth father and the other local Minotaurs, and had in fact enjoyed the experience on the whole, feeling like he had finally discovered some missing piece of his own personal history. Yet afterward, Ashkar had seemed shaken, though he attempted to cover for some unspecified discomfort in the aftermath of Titus receiving his spirit mark. Titus also had to admit to himself that part of his hesitation was that he still wanted to ask Ashkar why he hadn't at least tried to come see his only son when he had first been released from prison. Then again, what better day for family drama, the young man muttered to himself as he dialed the phone. When the line picked up, he said, "Hey, Ashkar, got a question for you. What would you say to coming here for Thanksgiving?"